Hi, I'm Stephen Smith, professor of political science, and I'm joined today by my colleagues, Andrew Reeves and Betsy Sinclair, coming to you from Washington University in St. Louis. With just a week until the election, we are here to talk about the U.S. presidential race, what the polls are telling us, and our confidence in whether Americans will accept the outcome. You know, Betsy and Andrew, we hear many people talking about how this is the most important election in their lifetime. Let's start with that. Do you think this is more important than recent previous elections, even 2016?
You know, we're political scientists, so we're used to looking at data and analyzing things. So it's tough to find the right context to answer a question like that. But looking back 4 years ago, I mean, that seemed like a very important election, especially in light of the things that we didn't know were going to happen, like the pandemic and the sort of importance of government in dealing with the particular crises that are in front of us. So that election 4 years ago was pretty darn important. And I think this one coming up is going to rank up there as well.
For Democrats, there's certainly a feeling that it is because there's such disdain for the incumbent Republican. For Republicans, I bet you get mixed reviews. Many of them might think that it's important to retain Trump policies and that this election is pretty important because they fear that there'll be a massive return to liberal-dominated government. But I think there's plenty of Republicans who are hoping for better times here and think that Trump is standing in the way.
Okay, this is exit poll data from 2016. 21% of exit poll respondents identified Supreme Court appointments as the most important factor. But breaking that down by the candidate for whom those people voted, 56% of Trump voters identified Supreme Court appointments as the most important factor in making that decision. And when I think about this election, I would say, we will have seen 3 Supreme Court appointments happen. I don't think for Republicans, this is going to look like the most important election. I think that we hear that both because this is a case where you see 2 parties that have diverged so dramatically in terms of their vision for the election. But I think for Democrats, this feels like an incredibly serious election. But for Republicans, it's the case that a lot of what they hope to accomplish in 2016 has already happened.
Do you both have faith in the polls after what happened in 2016?
I think one of the interesting things about 2016 that I think there's pretty good evidence on is that Trump did very well with voters who decided late. I think there were other problems with the polls that we can talk about, but I think there's pretty good evidence that's one of the things that happened. Clinton did not benefit in the way that Trump did from these late deciders. I don't know that that's going to be a factor this time around. I think Trump is an incumbent and has a record that he's running on. There's a lot less uncertainty about what kind of a president he would look like. That gives me a little more faith in the polls. The fact that I don't think this shy Trump voter exists, but we'll see.
I think a high quality poll typically has a margin of error of about 3%. So you could say, look at those results and add plus or minus 3%. And there's a lot of other noise that goes into polling. And there's measurement error, and it's going to be hard to reach. Some people are hard to reach. And so a good rule of thumb would be double that margin of error and see if the candidates are still split beyond about 6 percentage points. That's going to give you a good rule of thumb for saying, how close is this election actually going to be? And I think assuming that the models here that are generating reasonable likely voters, or that we're capturing the right set of registered voters, are going to then say, well, if Biden is outside of that 6 percentage points, you have some reasonable confidence in these polls. So I would say it's looking now that in terms of the popular vote, Biden will have it. And there's increasingly strong evidence in terms of state polling that some of these margins have really moved significantly from what we saw in 2016.
Yeah, Betsy's got it exactly right. Actually, the polls in 2016 were spot on. The average of the major polls gave Clinton a 3% advantage in national popular vote, and that's about what she had. It was between 2 and 3 percentage points. Of course, the Electoral College is another matter. And some of the polls struggled with state level predictions. And state level predictions are always more difficult. You're dealing with smaller samples and larger margins of error and trickier challenges in weighting. But in the national polls, they were really spot on. I'll share a screen that shows the current results. Way over here on the far right is the October 1 average of national polls on Real Clear Politics. You can see that we've gone through several seasons in the Biden-Trump matchup. Before we got into this election year, Biden had a big lead. And then when Biden started getting criticized by his fellow Democrats during the lead up to the primary season and during the early primary season, his numbers went down. That was also a period when the economic numbers started looking better and Trump's numbers went up. But when we got into the end of March, you can see that Trump's numbers begin to fall. Biden is way down. But then what happens in May and into June is an increase in the spread. Biden's lead begins to increase. Trump is taking a hit for the pandemic, and Biden is rallying support among Democrats. And that lasted pretty well, through June and July, that big Biden lead. And pretty much since the middle of August, it's tightened up a little bit. So now we're seeing averages that are, typically in the 6 to 8 or 9% gap. And that's a sizable gap, much larger than the margin of error that Betsy was talking about. So that's where things stand. Of course, things can change, as we saw in 2016 when FBI Director Comey announced the restart of the investigation on Clinton's emails. Clinton's numbers began to plummet, and they plummeted quickly. Most people would guess that if Biden is ahead by at least 3 or 4 points nationally, that he'll win the Electoral Vote College. But the way the electoral votes are distributed, if we get down below 3%, even if Biden is in the lead in most polls, then the Electoral College outcome is going to be so tight that it'll be impossible to predict the outcome.
Steve made the point about the state polls, and that is one area where I still have a lot of questions. I mean, the state polling didn't just get it wrong for Trump last time. They got it wrong for a lot of other Republican candidates in Republican and Democratic states. So I don't know that we have a complete answer for why that breakdown happened the way it did. And of course, the Electoral College, the way that this thing actually gets decided is at the state level. So I agree with everything that Betsy and Steve said, but I guess I still have some reservations about the polling the problems that we had last time and whether or not they're sort of fully fleshed out for 2020.
We are in a better position though this year, don't you think, guys? We have more and more polls with larger samples in the battleground states. The battleground states are better known this time, and the major polling organizations, including those that we would trust as good survey organizations, are all there now on a weekly basis.
One of the more exciting things about what we do is looking at polling data. And you might wonder if after the 2016 election, if polling firms really took a hit. And I think there has never been more heightened interest in polling. And it's actually arguably, there's been an explosion of firms doing polling. And so we're seeing many more actors engaged in many more ways of collecting data. So we're seeing people doing online polling. We're seeing them do, polls by text. We're seeing them do polls by phone. We're seeing address-based sampling frames going out to identify, a target population and sampling from those populations. And we're also seeing really creative modelers come in with new ways to capture a convenient sample and try to target what looks like a representative sample. And I think the combination of all of those things means that when you start to aggregate these polls together, you say, well, we're seeing a pretty consistent picture here. And the consistent picture with such a big gap is going to say, there's a lot of confidence about what things look like right now. I think it's also important to think about that this is in a year where modeling likely voters is going to be very different. And so a lot of the target population here, the people we're trying to capture in our surveys, are often likely voters. But this is the first time we've ever had to model likely voters in the middle of a global pandemic. It's also the case that the Democrats are running a very different ground game. So over half of Democrats do not want people to knock on their doors. The Biden campaign is not doing any door knocking. And I think it's a really interesting question to say, does that change our model of likely voters?
Betsy, I think you raised a really interesting point about the pandemic and this divide, this partisan divide in how we vote by method, not just who we're voting for. And I don't know the answer to this. Maybe you do. How are people accounting for that in the polling, right? Like this idea of, the mode, and are there obstacles for people trying to vote by mail? Like, is that being baked into these models or not so much?
So the answer is yes, but it's also the case that you see, the big firms are hedging. So every time YouGov releases a poll, they release the poll with a target population of registered voters and simultaneously with a target population of likely voters. So they're pretty well aware that that's something that people are thinking hard about.
And it may not affect estimates much. It does mean that people who cast their ballots early have made up their minds and can't change their minds. So more and more of the electorate is not going to be affected by the last month of the campaign. So more and more of the campaign is going to be focused on those few who have not cast a mail-in ballot and may show up on election day. But because of the parties being so polarized this year and the candidates being so well known, we're going to have naturally fewer undecided voters toward the end.
God forbid there's an outbreak of the virus around the election day, right? Then you could have major shifts in who's deciding to turn out if you didn't already cast your ballot via the mail, which then could, really dramatically change what we end up seeing on election day. We can't model those, right? Those are hard to account for.
Or who will be willing to serve as a polling place worker. Right. Those are people are, making democracy actually happen for $75, working for 12 plus hours, trying to help you cast your ballot. And they tend to be older adults. And those are people who have significant health risks. So if there are local outbreaks of coronavirus, they may not actually be willing to show up to put in that kind of day, put in that kind of exposure. So I think there are these two countervailing forces, which is there's a lot of uncertainty about the process. This is a very different ground game for both campaigns, but especially for Democrats. And it's also the case that we have never before had such incredible modeling capacities.
Do you both have faith in the polls?
Maybe I'm going to share my screen and then I'm going to tell you a story. This is from data from the American Panel Survey, which is a really exciting survey that we did as part of the Wiedenbaum Center, because we were able to ask the same people questions over a very long period of time. So this data represents the same respondents for whom we ask whether or not they have confidence that their vote was counted as they intended. And we asked them that question starting in October of 2014, and we asked them the last time for that same question in January of 2017. And what's really exciting, so I'm going to break out this figure in terms of the red line are people who voted for Trump in 2016, and the blue line are people who voted for Clinton. And if you look at this figure, what you note is that in 2014, the Clinton voters are a little more confident that their vote will be counted as intended. But as you move into October of 2016, remembering these are the same people, you start to see some split between those two kinds of voters. And this split comes as a direct consequence of what we in political science call priming, which is that Trump is going out making a lot of public speeches about a rigged election. And his supporters respond with concern that their vote will not be counted as they intended. And so this is a scale that goes from 1 to 4. And there's a decrease of about 1/3 of a point in terms of the confidence that they have that their vote will be counted as intended. And then the election happens and something amazing happens, which is that confidence flips. And so those same Trump voters who were concerned in October suddenly become real confident that their vote is going to be counted as intended. Their candidate won. And they actually increased their confidence, which we call the winner effect, that their ballot was counted by almost 2/3 of a point. And that effect persists through December of 2016 and then all the way through to January of 2017 when we stop asking them that question. And I think this says something very real about how human beings make decisions and how people use their own lived experience to understand the world around them. And I think it also is somewhat troubling for what's sort of likely to happen this November, because we just talked about all those Biden polling numbers. And so yet again, you see Trump making public statements about a rigged election. And we showed you that the polling numbers are pretty consistently supporting Biden. So should Biden win, we won't see this winner effect. We're going to see a whole bunch of voters who are not confident that their ballot was counted as intended, despite the preponderance of literature that our election systems are actually designed to be run by really wonderful human beings who are trying their very best to make sure every single ballot is counted. And so I think, it's a tough moment here for American democracy. I think a lot of people are going to feel that they lose a sense of legitimacy in the process because of this priming, because of the nature of how people listen to elite speech.
Well, we repeated those questions this past August, and we asked about a little bit more detail because of what the candidates have been saying so far. We asked about three kinds of concerns about election integrity. One was fraud in mail-in voting. Another is intervention by foreign countries in the campaign. And the other is election administration, cheating in the vote count by election officials. You can see that with respect to fraud and mail-in voting, nearly all Trump supporters think that's a problem. He has persuaded his supporters, here's 87%, saying that that they're very or somewhat concerned about that, and less than half of the Biden supporters. It's important that it's not a small percentage of Biden supporters. They've bought into this to some degree too. Intervention by foreign countries, that's just the opposite. Biden supporters think that that's a pretty serious problem, and only a minority of Trump supporters do. Small to sizable majorities of both Biden and Trump supporters are concerned about election administration, about the vote count. Maybe some of that is the fact that we've got more mail-in votes and people have come to be concerned about delays and shenanigans in counting the vote. But we can see huge differences between the two parties, and whichever party loses, the other one is going to be filled with people who thought that they were cheated. And that could yield a pretty ugly set of incentives for the candidates themselves to play games after election night.
The sad part of this is in some ways this is a sideshow, right? Because this idea that there's massive fraud that's going out there is one thing, but there are people who have to stand in line for hours to vote because of underfunded or sort of strategically decided election resources. So a lot of this comes down to capacity and local officials that are trying to do their best but don't have the resources. And unfortunately, that's often related to the resources, sometimes a race of a particular place. That means that people have to spend a lot more time and exert a lot more effort to vote. And that's a real tragedy, I think, in this country, that it's not easier.
Of course, this was going to be complicated no matter what with the pandemic. Social distancing was going to force delays, sometimes been used as an excuse by local officials to cut down on the number of polling places. They've been forced to move to larger venues. So there were going to be serious problems anyway. This overlay of partisan back and forth about the manipulation of the process certainly threatens the perceived legitimacy of the outcome.
Right? It's this idea that we as citizens are part of this system and we accept outcomes, even if they don't go our way, and we respect the system and we come back next time to participate again, even when we lose. I think when we see our politicians promoting ideas of our system being illegitimate, that's really disheartening and worrying. So that's something that I hope we get through and keep the system going and legitimacy high.
I completely agree with everything Andrew just said. It's exactly right. I mean, I think November 4th is coming. And on November 4th, we have to figure out how to live together and how to support the myriad of democratic institutions in which we are embedded. Our national politics is only one of them. So everyone is in a school district and, lives in a county and in a state. And there are all kinds of municipal elections and requirements in a participatory democracy that people have to do to sustain the democratic institution. So I feel like if there's one thing I was going to ask people to do, I would say, if you are healthy and well, please go volunteer to be a polling place worker. That would be a terrific use of your time on November 3rd. And on November 4th, figure out a way to make a friend with someone who has different political opinions than you do, and figure out how to fill potholes or build cross rocks or vote in your school board elections, because those are the things that are going to sustain the democratic enterprise until the next presidential election.